Hey everybody, welcome back to IAU. IAU, as always, is brought to you by TroyCast.com. Check us out. That's our home webpage, www.troycast.com. And congratulations to Waffleman19 on YT. You are the winner of our September podcast launch promotion. Shoot us an email at troycastpodcast@gmail.com to collect your prize. Congrats. All right, my guest today, he is an author. He is a Mafia historian. He is a journalist. He is a Hollywood consultant. And he's also the host of the original Gangster Podcast. Welcome to the show, my friend, Scott Burnstein. Scott, welcome to the show. How's it going?
Thanks, Timmy. Thanks for having me, man. Yeah, I'm excited to get on the air with you guys and chop it up.
Hey, congrats on the new podcast, by the way.
Thanks. It's been a labor of love this last year, and people have been telling me now for the last 5-6 years I needed to dive headfirst into that into the space, the podcasting space that's really been blowing up across multiple media landscapes. I've been pleasantly surprised. I was a little hesitant. I don't know why. I've always kind of been intimidated by technology and getting out of my comfort zone, but I'm glad I did. And I have some great partners over at Intercom, and they've helped make this a reality. And I'm really excited to talk about it and share it with your audience.
And for everybody listening, Scott's podcast is the original Gangsters Podcast. Can you tell everybody where they can find it?
Yeah, you can find it on radio.com or iTunes, or going directly to the Intercom website or to the various Intercom radio station websites in Detroit. The two main ones I would shout out would be WWJ 950 AM and 97.1 The Ticket FM.
Great show, by the way. I listened to a couple episodes over the weekend. I heard the George Jung episode, and man, what a great interview.
Yeah, we're trying to find that sweet spot between pop culture, organized crime, the underworld, but also kind of keep it there for people to have some cultural touchstones to relate to, so we're not getting too far deep into the weeds and getting too kind of geeky with. There's a lot of rabbit holes you can go down when you consider yourself a organized crime historian or a mobologist or whatever, that can kind of fly over the head of the general public. So we want to make this for mass consumption and keep it rooted in music, movies, television, fashion that people can relate to, and how those parts of society, and those parts of media and pop culture have been inspired by a lot of true crime. And we like to tell those stories and get great interview subjects into the podcast, where they can kind of expand and color up and really give the perspective of this landscape, where you've seen the movie Scarface or you've seen the movie Goodfellas, but we're going to tell you, or you've heard the rap by Biggie Smalls, 10 Crack Commandments, but we're going to take you behind the scenes. And actually Biggie Smalls was inspired by a Detroit drug crew known as the Chambers Brothers, who had the 10 Crack Commandments up on every one of their crack house walls, and that's how he wrote the song 10 Crack Commandments. I'm just giving that's an example to your audience of like how we kind of like to do these deep dives and show people that like a lot of these cultural touchstones were inspired by some pretty substantial and historically significant true crime stories.
So take me back to the beginning on this. I know organized crime has been not only a passion and also been somewhat of a career for you. What got this started for you with this passion for the subject?
Well, I got it. It's in my blood. The Purple Gang, which was Detroit's most iconic criminal group, a group that had worldwide headlines back during Prohibition. They ran the Detroit River and all the bootlegging in Michigan during the 1920s and early 1930s, and they were my great grandpa's first cousins, the Burnstein brothers, Abe, Ray, Joe, and Izzy, and they were the biggest, baddest Jewish gangsters in Detroit at that time period. So I always had it kind of in my family history, and I'd heard stories, but it really didn't kind of become a passion of mine or something that I wanted to focus on in terms of my career or something I wanted to study and write about until I was in law school and this would have been in the early 2000s. And I was in law school in Chicago, and I worked an internship for 2 of my 3 years in law school. I worked for the Illinois Attorney General's office, and within the Illinois Attorney General's office, I worked in criminal prosecution, in the criminal prosecution department, in organized crime. So I was helping build, as an intern in law school, helping Illinois Attorney Generals and the Cook County Sheriff's Department, in coordination with the FBI and ATF, build mob cases. And it opened up this whole world to me. And it basically, for lack of a better expression, I mean, it brought some of my favorite movies like Goodfellas and Casino and Donnie Brasco. They brought it to life in front of me. Like I was like actually going on interviews and stakeouts and doing surveillance reports and tracking down evidence, or I was helping all these Cook County Sheriff's Department detectives and assistant attorney generals run all this information down. It just fascinated me, and I immediately kind of turned my attention to my hometown, Detroit. And I was lucky that there really had not been a ton written about the Detroit mob and the Detroit underworld, despite the fact that it's such rich terrain to mine for historical material and stories, and it plays such a historically significant role in the American underworld landscape. What's happened in Detroit, what's currently happening in Detroit. It's such a kind of a linchpin to the whole story, a cornerstone of the whole story of the American underworld, that I was lucky I got to come in, and I hadn't even turned 30, and I got a book deal to kind of write about the history of the Detroit Mafia when I was 28, and it sparked my whole career. And now I've kind of expanded into some other areas like Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia. It's it's a true it's a true labor of love.
I had no idea how deep the Detroit organized crime ran until I started reading some of your stuff. It's got a pretty rich and deep history.
Yeah, and it's crazy it still exists, and for whatever reason the media around here just kind of turns a blind eye, and I've been questioning that, and I've been perplexed by that, probably since I came on the scene in the late 2000s. My first book was released in early 2007, and for the most part the media here just ignores them, and they get a free pass. I'm really the only person around that keeps tabs on them and writes frequently or semi-frequently about them. And you have to really kind of look for my stuff. I mean, you can't turn on your local WDIV Channel 4 News or flip on the radio unless you're going to, the website and going to my podcast or whatnot. You're not flipping on WWJ or WJR or Channel 4 on your television, and you don't hear them talking about the Mafia around here. And if you didn't know any better, you'd think it didn't exist. But I'm sure there are lots of reasons for that.
Do you have any theories behind that?
Yeah, the Detroit guys, the Detroit mob's such an outlier. They've been able to thrive in the shadows for so many years, and they're really the Ivy League of organized crime in America, the Cadillac of mob families. And they're incredibly diversified and integrated into white-collar business, a lot of legal bureaucracy, a lot of municipalities, judges, attorneys, corporate CEOs, and whatnot, big industrialists, big business in the state of Michigan. And I think that they have protectors. And I think that whenever there's been situations, and I can talk, I shouldn't say I can talk, but I know of some situations where there were some big investigative pieces that were in the works these last 10, 11, 12 years, some with some major media outlets in Detroit that were squelched or quashed, were killed at the last second, no pun intended, before they went to print, because of some potential blowback that the media outlets were being threatened with by these members of organized crime and their tentacles into corporate Detroit, corporate America, corporate the Michigan business sector. And I think a lot of these guys have that kind of protection and those kind of shields and that type of veil of legitimacy.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was Jimmy Hoffa, and mainly because you can't really talk about organized crime in Detroit without getting into the Hoffa conversation.
You cannot.
I noticed your podcast has been catching some traction with some more national media on some of the theories behind the new Irishman movie that's coming up.
Yeah.
For those of you that are listening, Martin Scorsese has a new movie upcoming. It's going to be a De Niro, Pesci type of deal. Organized crime focuses on.
If people have a recollection of basketball in the early '90s, they had the Dream Team, right? You had Magic, Michael, Larry Bird, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, all on the same team. And this movie called The Irishman is the equivalent of that for a mob movie. All the greatest actors from the greatest mob movies of the last 30, 40 years are coming together with the greatest director of all time, Marty Scorsese, and making a movie. Pacino, De Niro, Pesci, Keitel. It's pretty epic.
In the theory that I saw that you spoke about, I don't remember your source in this, and you could probably correct me on this, but didn't they say something about there's no way the mob would have entrusted such an important hit as Jimmy Hoffa to a non-Italian?
Yeah. Well, it's more than just that. I mean, it's unfortunately, I'm sure the movie will be outstanding art. It just will be fictitious. The story that the movie is telling you that Frank Sheeran was the man that killed Jimmy Hoffa is just, it's a ridiculous notion that anybody with any true knowledge of the case dismisses. Anybody with any real knowledge of who Frank Sheeran was, anyone that with real knowledge of what were the machinations at play with the Jimmy Hoffa kidnapping, disappearance, the greatest mob murder ever pulled off, the greatest American unsolved mystery of all time, probably. There's no way that they're entrusting someone like Frank Sheeran, who, besides the fact that he wasn't Italian, he wasn't a trusted member of organized crime. He was someone that, yes, knew Jimmy Hoffa, someone that was in bed with some of the mob bosses that possibly played a role in giving the final sign-off for Jimmy Hoffa to be murdered. But by no means was Frank Sheeran ever given the authority to be part of the Jimmy Hoffa assassination, in my opinion. He was someone that was all talk and not a lot of action. And he was, in terms of this story. Now, he was a hitman for the mob. He was someone that had killed people, was someone that was a Teamsters boss in Delaware. But the notion that the Detroit family that was responsible for Jimmy Hoffa and that was given the contract, the contract on Hoffa, and were in charge of putting together and coordinating the specifics, it's offensive. It's insulting to a lot of these guys that were involved in it or know people that were involved in it. A lot of them say to me, they're like, yeah, you think we needed some drunk Irishman from Delaware to come to Detroit to handle our own house cleaning? Like, come on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, in Detroit, you have a group of mobsters in Detroit that are well versed on how to pull off murders without getting arrested, without getting suspected. In the history of the Detroit Mafia, dating back to 1931, when this modern day crime family was birthed, there hasn't been any made members of the organized crime family in Detroit to be convicted of a murder. So, I mean, that's incredibly rare. Every other city, there's been dozens. In Detroit, you don't have one.
So where did this story come from then? Do you think it's possible that this was leaked to throw the scent off somebody else?
No, I think this was a man at the end of his life that was desperate to leave some type of legacy. And he had some enablers, people in his ear that were telling him that the only way you're really going to make a mark for yourself and that people will remember you would be to fabricate a story. I know that Frank Sheeran was selling a book on 2 or 3 different occasions. Before this particular book, I Heard You Paint Houses, was sold. He was selling his own life story without any mention of killing Jimmy Hoffa and couldn't get anyone to purchase it. And I know that there was some changes in the approach to the book proposal. And all of a sudden it was added that not only did he kill Jimmy Hoffa, but he also killed Crazy Joe Gallo, which is another one of the most infamous unsolved mob murders of all time that happened in 1972 in Little Italy in Manhattan. And all of a sudden he confesses to those 2 murders. And not only does his book get bought, but it becomes a New York Times bestseller. And now it's getting made into a film by Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. So at the end of the day, he's the one who has the last laugh. But, in terms of history, historical sake, this is a bastardization of the truth. What's going to be espoused as fact in the new movie, The Irishman.
Do you have any theories that you can speak about that aren't going to get you thrown into the Detroit River tonight?
Yeah. I believe that it was a murder contract that was most likely pulled off in tandem between the Detroit mob, also known as the Tocco-Zerilli crime family, and the Genovese crime family out of New York, specifically their New Jersey satellite wing that was run by Tony Provenzano. I believe it's possible that it was just the Detroit guys that did it, but more likely it was probably a combination of the Detroit guys and the Genovese Jersey crew. I believe that the hit team consisted of Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, who was a Detroit mob capo, Anthony Tony Palazzolo, who was a Detroit mob soldier, Salvatore Sally Bugs Bergoglio, who was a well-known hitman from the Genovese crime family and the Tony Provenzano crew, and probably quote-unquote cleanup duties were left to the Andretta brothers, Stevie and Tommy Andretta, who were two of Tony Provenzano's proteges and Sally Bugs' proteges that I believe were on the scene as well. I believe that Hoffa was picked up at the Red Fox restaurant on Telegraph and Maple at around 2:45 in the afternoon by Billy Giacalone and Tony Palazzolo. Probably Sally Bugs was in the car as well to let Hoffa believe that he was going to meet Tony Pro, because just to give people a little background, Jimmy Hoffa disappeared on his way to meet Tony Giacalone and Tony Provenzano for a quote-unquote sit-down to resolve some bad blood between Hoffa and Provenzano and try to clear the way, in Hoffa's mind, clear the way for him to reclaim the Teamsters Union in the 1976 Teamsters presidential election. So Billy Giacalone was there to let Jimmy know that he was taking Jimmy to go meet his brother Tony, and I believe that Sally Bugs was there to let Jimmy Hoffa be under the impression that if Sally Bugs is there, that means that Tony Provenzano is waiting for him wherever they were taking him, just to kind of keep the ruse up that he was going to the sit down and that he wasn't headed to his slaughter. I believe he got into that car, which was been identified as a car owned by Joey Giacalone, who was the son of Tony Giacalone, the nephew of Billy Giacalone. I believe he was taken in that car for about a 5-minute ride to Long Lake and Telegraph Road, where there was another house that was owned by a mob soldier by the name of Carlo Licata. Licata was a brother-in-law to the acting mob boss of Detroit at that time, Jack Tocco. I know I'm throwing out a lot of names. I apologize if it's getting confusing.
No.
Licata's house was a house that had been used before for sit-downs between Hoffa and the Giacalones. It was a house that kind of existed in between the east side and the west side and was often used as a place for meetings between Italian mobsters that were coming from the east to the west and non-Italians, but sometimes Italians that lived on the west side and needed a place to meet and hold conferences and whatnot in private. Carlo Licata's house was known as a place that held those kind of meetings. Tony Giacalone's headquarters was at the South Athletic Club, which is on the west side. Hoffa had his house up in Lake Orion. So the house at Long Lake and Telegraph was kind of a middle ground for Giacalone and Hoffa. And as I said before, it was a place that Hoffa had gone and met the Giacalones before at. And I believe that he was taken to that house, which is about a quarter mile east of Telegraph on Long Lake Road on the north side of Long Lake Road. And I believe he was killed at that location and then probably taken to Central Sanitation, which was a trash company owned by members of the Detroit mob, including Tony Palazzolo, who I believe was driving the car. Tony Palazzolo's mentor in the Mafia was a guy by the name of Pete Vitale. Pete Vitale owned Central Sanitation. I believe they probably took off of there and incinerated him. The Central Sanitation burned down in a suspicious arson fire in 1978 before the FBI could ever get a search warrant to get into the premises. And Pete Vitale, who was the Detroit mob's godfather of Greektown and ran the whole downtown area off of Monroe Street for years, he was most likely the liaison for the Detroit mob to the New York Genovese crew. And Pete Vitale was followed to New York in the days after Hoffa disappeared and was seen meeting with Genovese bosses at a social club in Harlem. And it's believed that Vitale was going there to fill the Genovese crime family administration in on the specifics of what had just happened. So that's what I believe, a kind of soup to nuts, beginning to end, what probably happened that day. I don't dismiss other possibilities. The one thing that I believe that my contribution to the annals of Hoffa research is that I I believe that I've pinned down where he was taken to be killed, which was the Licata house. That's what I'm most confident in terms of exactly who were the hitters and exactly where his body was disposed of. I'm less certain of, but I would say that I'm confident that he was taken to Licata's house and murdered there, and I'm confident that at the very least Billy Giacalone was on site for the Detroit mob as the quarterback of the murder contract.
Well, growing up in the Detroit area, the Hoffa murder has always been a thing of folklore, and I've heard stories of
mythology.
Oh yeah, for sure. I've heard that he's the walls of the lodge. I've heard that he's all the way over Renaissance Center, the Meadowlands. Just a lot of off the wall stories. Where did you compile your research? Was it mainly based on interviews or books or combination of both?
Yeah, I've read most of the books that have been written, if not all the books that have ever been written about it. But I'm a belief of you got to jump into the mud and get your hands dirty. And I've interviewed over a dozen FBI agents that worked the case both hot and cold, over a dozen Michigan State police officers that worked the case both hot and cold, and over a dozen Detroit mob street figures that either had direct knowledge or indirect knowledge from strong sources regarding the Hoffa disappearance. So I've gone right to the horse's mouth, if you will, as well as being able to get my hands on about 500, 600 pages of federal records that detail the investigation.
So doing all these interviews, can you make any comments as towards if you look at all the pop culture movies about the mafia and organized crime, what do you think would be the best depiction of these guys that you've actually interviewed?
I think the most accurate depiction of what the mob is really like at its essence is Donnie Brasco and the character that Al Pacino plays, which is kind of a pathetic, spoke on the wheel mob middleman. And that's what most guys are in that world. It's not glamorous. It's grinding out a living. It's working at your criminal craft to get probably the same kind of money you would get if you worked a desk job in the corporate world. Everyone has these images because of the more romanticized versions of the mafia and in Goodfellas and The Godfather and Casino about this kind of lavish lifestyle, and that's really only 1% of these guys. That's the very high end, the top end. Most of these guys are just grunts, and I think that the movie Donnie Brasco and the Pacino's portrayal of that character was pretty understated, and Pacino's a guy that does all this stuff incredibly overstated. So I give him a lot of credit, I think, for that, the way that he approached that performance. But he did such an amazing job, I think, of just really capturing the hamster on a wheel. Like, no matter what you do, it's a glass ceiling. Only certain people are going to rise in that world. And for that character, he's a guy that he, supposedly had killed 24 people, and it didn't mean anything. He was never going to get outside of being just kind of an ant marching. And I thought that was a fascinating way to portray a mob character, because all the other mob characters we see are kind of so kind of glamorous and rich and slick, and there was nothing rich or slick about the lefty character that Pacino played in that movie.
Do you think it'd be fair to say that pedigree and bloodline is important as far as moving up? More so than the core. Yeah. More so than in a lot of professions. Yeah. If you have a bloodline, if you have a father, a grandfather, uncles that are in the business, it can really grease the tracks for you and lead to a quick ascension. Sometimes having nothing to do with merit. I did a lot of amateur research, if you will, the last couple of days, just leading up to the interview here about the Gambino family, and I think that'd be a prime example right there of showing the bloodline passed down. Yeah.
So when John Gotti, who everyone probably knows, probably the most famous or notorious mob boss of the last 65 years, maybe, ran the New York Gambino family in the late 80s, early 90s, and was on the cover of People magazine, Time magazine. He was kind of a modern day Al Capone. I would say Capone and Gotti and maybe Whitey Bulger now, the three most notorious mob bosses of the last 100 years. And when Gotti went down in 92, he passed the family on to his son, who was really ill-equipped to be the godfather of one of the five families. You got to understand, in New York City, the five families are the pillars of mob activity in New York, dating back to the early 1930s. And there's five groups, like five corporations. And unlike other cities where a mob family might have 30, 40, 50 guys in it, at its peak, you might have 100 guys. And this was years ago. But in New York, at its peak, you might have had 1,000 guys in one mafia family. Now when other families are down to dealing with maybe 30 guys, the New York families still have 300, 400 each in their own ranks. So they're just much bigger deals. And John Gotti Jr., who at the time I believe was 25 years old, or less than 25, 26 years old, and just took over for his dad and really ran the family's mob empire into the ground. Then passed it on to his uncle, who was John Gotti's brother. Peter Gotti went on to tank the family even more than his nephew had done. And it's just been the last decade or so where the Sicilian wing of the Gambinos have taken control and stabilized things within the Gambino family. But that all came from this kind of European influence that came over here from the 70s forward and have kind of taken control of the family after the Gotti reign. But to your point, John Gotti, there's a lot of debate on whether or not John Gotti was a good boss or a bad boss. Something that you can debate, but I don't think it's debatable whether or not his son and his brother were good or bad bosses. They were very emphatically known as bad mob bosses, and it didn't serve John Gotti very well by keeping his family that he had built to the power that he had built it with his own bloodline. It would have probably served him better to have just other loyalists that have his best interest in mind running his family, as opposed to his actual blood family running his family, because they didn't do a very good job of it.
I think I read somewhere too that John Gotti III is actually an MMA fighter now with the UFC.
Yeah, one of his grandsons. Yeah.
So the five families in New York, does that correspond to the five boroughs at all, or is that just
all five families have activities in all five boroughs. So the five families would be the Gambinos, the Bonanos, the Colombos, the Lucchese's, and the Genovese. Genovese is generally considered the most sophisticated, most well-run organization. The Bonanos, the Colombos are kind of known as dysfunctional organizations, and the Gambinos and the Lucchese's are kind of the middle ground.
What do you know about the roots of organized crime and how it started out here in America? Because this obviously probably started over, I'm guessing, in Italy or Sicily originally.
There were different secret societies, different mafia clans that came with all the people that immigrated to the United States from Europe in the early 20th century, and all these immigrants spread out to different metropolises around America. A lot of them bringing some of that old world tradition with them into their new cities. And let's say between the early 1900s into the heart of Prohibition and into, let's say, the late 1920s, you had this kind of very loosely connected group of mob bosses that had little individual fiefdoms, and within those fiefdoms you had various bootlegging crews that were fighting for territory and power, and it wasn't very organized. And then at some point in 1931, a very famous mobster by the name of Lucky Luciano, along with his partner Benjamin Bugsy Siegel and his other partner Meyer Lansky, the most powerful Jewish mobster of all time, they created what became known as the modern day American Mafia, or La Cosa Nostra, at a mob don convention in Chicago in late 1931. And he called Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel called all the mob bosses from around the country together at this hotel in Chicago and agreed to implement a fully formed organization, and it would there would no longer be these kind of loose connections. Everything would be tied in with each other. There would be 26 different cities, 26 different mob families, and then there would be a board of directors known as the Commission that would oversee all of disputes, all policy decisions for the whole country's mob, and that the Commission would be comprised of the most powerful mob bosses in America. So you had the five families that had all 5 dons on the commission, and then you also were other mob bosses from the country that got seats on the commission were Detroit's Joe Zerilli, Chicago's Al Capone, which eventually became Tony Accardo's regime. For a while, the boss in Philadelphia, Angelo Bruno. For a while, the boss in New England, Raymond Patriarca. And for a short period of time, I believe the mob don of Cleveland was also on the commission. But it was a ruling body for the entire American Mafia, and it existed up until pretty recently. I think the last official commission meeting might have taken place in the 2000s.
One of the things that I really have always been fascinated with the mob is the rank structure and the rituals that I love.
It's structured like a military or a corporate international conglomerate. Very layered, very insulated, firm pecking order, chain of command.
Did you see I'm assuming you've seen all the Sopranos episodes,
yes,
right?
I know them by heart.
Do you remember the scene where I think it was a scene where they made Christopher?
Yep.
What have you learned about the
ceremonies?
Yeah.
Each family does a kind of a different variation of the same ceremony, but I think some families have little nuances to it. But for the most part, I mean, it's you get called to a private ceremony, and they prick your finger and draw blood and set on fire the picture of a saint, and the fire, the saint card burns in your hands. You pledge an oath. You pledge a blood oath to the family, and that you pledge that your crime family is more important than your blood family, and you do it by taking a blood oath. I know in Detroit they all hold hands before the ceremony and then after the ceremony, and say some type of prayer before and after. And I've heard that in a couple other families too, but that's not something that is uniform. But I know in Detroit, dating back to Joe Zerilli, he started that back in the 30s, where they would start the meeting with everyone joining hands, and then after the meeting was over, the new initiates would be a part of the circle with the everyone joining hands, and they weren't before that, and it kind of represents them taking that next step in their climbing of the ladder in the crime family.
Did they take that oath as serious as they do in the movies?
Yeah, I don't think it. In the last 30 years, you don't have to kill somebody to become a made member of the Mafia. I would say from the 1930s into the 1980s, you did. I would say from about probably the late 1980s, early 90s till now, you don't. If you're someone that can make money and you're someone that can show that they're loyal, that's enough. And in fact, right now, you probably have a much better chance of getting your button, so to say, or getting inducted into the Mafia in 2020 if you're a moneymaker, as opposed to just someone who's a knuckle dragger, an enforcer, a thug, a hitman.
I got a question for you. This is going to be out of left field, but I'm trying to vet a story. My late grandfather, he's a World War II vet, used to always talk about a gangster named Lefty Clark. Do you know anything about this guy?
Yeah, for sure. Lefty Clark was a pretty big deal. He ran part of Corktown in, I believe his real name was William Bischoff, and he went by the nickname Lefty Clark. Ran part of the southwest side of Detroit. Eventually got into Las Vegas. But yeah, Lefty Clark was a pretty significant gangland presence in Detroit in the 20s, 30s, 40s before he moved to Vegas.
So what else you got going on right now besides the podcast?
Got the podcast. I got 2 projects I'm doing out in LA right now. One could be a scripted TV show. One is a docuseries about a missing girl that went missing from Indiana University in 2011. We're trying to find her body as well as get in handcuffs the person that killed her.
No kidding.
And then I'm working as a consultant, kind of developed a little side gig for myself the last 5-6 years doing Hollywood consultancies, where Hollywood TV and movie shows, TV shows, movies, sometimes podcasts will come in and pay me a consultant fee to help them shape their content. So right now I'm a consultant on a movie that's coming out called The Traitor, and it's about the first Sicilian mobster to ever become a witness for the government, and he helped bring down pretty much the entire Mafia over in Italy and Sicily. And this all happened in the early 1980s. And it's going to be a contender for Best Foreign Film at the Academy Awards.
No kidding.
Yep.
Well, congrats on that.
Thanks.
What era did you say that took place in?
It was the early 1980s, like 82, 83.
Nice. Are you still doing the sports writing?
Yep, and I still do on the side. I do writing about college football and basketball recruiting for the Oakland Press, as well as State Champs, Yellow Flag. Do a little radio here and there. Staying busy.
You got any hot takes on any recruits for us this year?
I'll tell you, I'm a huge fan of the quarterback at Walled Lake Western. If we want to start diving into my recruiting portal, I got a quarterback, 6'3", 215 pounds. His name is Zach Trainer. I think he'll be the best quarterback in the class of 2021. Thrown for close to 2,000 yards through 6 games, and got a lot of swagger, a lot of the both tangibles and intangible factors that you need to be great under center. And I've been really impressed by what I've seen from him. And then another quarterback prospect I really like out of Davison, Brendan Sullivan. Played receiver last year as a sophomore, moved under center as a junior, and is really lighting it up. And I think that Sullivan and Trainer will probably be the only Power 5 conference quarterbacks that we have in state right now.
Any chance they'd be heading close to home?
Right now, like I said, both these guys don't have, in terms of prospecting in the state of Michigan right now, our quarterback crop is really, dare I say, lackluster. We don't have any quarterbacks from freshman class to senior class. Well, I take that back. A freshman, I believe DJ Moore, the freshman quarterback at Detroit King, holds a Michigan offer right now. But besides that, we don't have any quarterbacks with any Power 5 offers, meaning that all the quarterbacks in the state right now, from freshman to senior class, all they have are mid-majors offering them, which kind of speaks to not the strongest group of quarterbacks. So Trainer and Sullivan, neither of them have Power 5 conference offers right now. Right now, they just have mid-majors looking at them. I think both of them will get those Power 5 offers as the months go forward here. But I don't know. I think there's a lot more of the story to be told on their recruiting. So I hope they stay close to home. I know Michigan needs some quarterbacking.
The other day I was listening. I don't know if it was on the radio or if it was something I saw on ESPN. One of the talking heads was making comments about the state of Michigan and Michigan State currently. Obviously, they don't seem to be having the best seasons as of right now, even though Michigan has a good record, State has a mediocre record. Yep. But one of the points that they were making, and I wish I could remember who said it, but they said that part of the reason why they were not seeing them as competitive as you would see like in Alabama or even in Ohio State is because of the fact that they're in Michigan, and they're saying
there's been a dip. There's been a little dip in recruiting talent.
And what do you think that's due to?
So many different factors. I think in some positions there's no dip. I mean, right now I think in terms of linemen, guys in the trenches, I don't think there are many better states in the U.S. to go find guys that are going to be road graders and pass protectors, as well as pass rushers and run pluggers. There's a lot of big nasties in Michigan over the last couple of years. I mean, elite talent in terms of linemen. We just have had kind of a weak run of high tier talent quarterbacks and running backs recently. There just hasn't been a ton of them, and I don't really know what the root of it is, but there just has not been a ton of great running backs or quarterbacks that have come through the last 5 years.
One of the theories I heard was it had a little bit to do with the climate. They're saying that these kids down in Florida and Texas and Georgia and Alabama, these kids are playing football 365 down there because they have the weather for it.
But that's always been the case, though.
That's what I was thinking, because if that was the case, then Michigan would have never had a glory day, and even Notre Dame, and even like look at Nebraska, they had their time in the spotlight. You would think that, I mean, Ohio State's not exactly in a tropical climate either, so I guess I don't buy that. I guess I don't buy the climate theory, but it's just puzzling to why our crop of recruits.
I think there's just ebbs and flows and peaks and valleys, and I mean, last year we only had 2 highly ranked quarterbacks in the state, but they were both Power 5 guys. One went to Georgia, and the other one went to Boston College. Frankly, I don't know what their projections at the next level are. So there are other kids. What I'm saying is guys that weren't 5 stars that I could see, or weren't 4 or 5 star quarterbacks that I could see going and playing at mid majors and making it to the league, as opposed to the guys that I've seen, some of the 4 and 5 stars that might be going to the dance with the prettier girl, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, coming home as the homecoming king. The homecoming king is getting that NFL contract.
So what do you think happened to the talent in Detroit when you and I were growing up? It seemed like there was just blue chippers coming out of everywhere in Detroit, and it's not like that anymore.
It's been the death of the PSL, the death of the Catholic League, or what the PSL and what the Catholic League were when we were growing up. And the Catholic Central is still is one of the best conferences you'll be able to find in America. But when you get past the Catholic League Central, which by the way is only 4 teams,
right,
the rest of the Catholic League is just a shadow of what it was at one point. 20 years ago, you probably had 30 programs in the Catholic League, and probably 15 to 20 of them were formidable. And in the PSL, you went from 40 high schools or something, or 35, 40 high schools at one point. Now they're down to 12 or 13.
What happened there? Do you think it's just a decline in the population?
Yeah.
They can't fill the schools.
Charter schools, population decline, urban sprawl, open enrollment. I think there's a lot of root causes.
You have any big names in basketball that you're high on right now?
In Oakland County, we got a McDonald's All-American candidate in Isaiah Jackson. So that should be exciting. He was at prep school last year at Spire Academy in Ohio, and we haven't had a McDonald's All-American in a handful of years in Oakland County. I believe probably since James Jung, I'm thinking in 2012 or 13.
That was a kid from Troy that went to Rochester, right?
Yes. Maybe, I don't remember if Edmund Sumner was McDonald's All-American. I don't think he was. Sumner's with the Pacers right now. But, so I'm happy that Isaiah Jackson came back to Oakland County. He played in Oakland County as a freshman at Rochester Hills Lutheran Northwest, and then went the charter school route, was at Detroit, Old Redford, and then as a junior he played at the Spire on the prep school circuit, and then he came back this summer and enrolled at Mott, is where his brother graduated from, is where his sister, I believe, is a junior now. It's always great to have, get your talent to come back if they've left, and I think in basketball more so than in football, we have a really disturbing trend over the last decade of guys, the best talent in the state, leaving to go to prep schools. So it's encouraging to see one of them coming back. And he's 6'9" and great fundamentals, great technique. Someone that has a lot of motor to its game, and it reminds me of Dennis Rodman, but a little bit more polished. He's someone that is considered the best defender and possibly the best rebounder in America, which in the stat sheet might not do a ton for you in terms of the glitz and glamour, but in terms of coaches and scouts, that means a lot.
Is that prep school trend? Is that something you're seeing nationwide, or is that a big Michigan thing?
I don't know. I know that all of a sudden the floodgates kind of opened up in Michigan with Josh Jackson and Miles Bridges, and it seems like every year we got guys that are leaving.
I just don't see how much more exposure these kids can get, especially when they're playing AAU. I mean, these kids are playing hoops all year round when you consider AAU and all the other tournament. I
will say though, there is an example that happened last year that proves what you just said and what I agree with you in what you just said, but I think it's probably the exception to the rule, but still it deserves mention. Wendell Green, one of the best sophomore point guards in Metro Detroit, 2 years ago played for Detroit Country Day, had trouble getting offers, part of it having to do with his size, which is only about 5'9" point guard, and transferred to Spire Academy with Isaiah Jackson. Oh, sorry. I let me back up for a second. He did not transfer to Spire Academy. He transferred out of state, did not go to Spire. He transferred to La Lumiere Prep in Indiana, which is one of the top prep schools in America. Earned the starting job for them last year. Took them close to a national championship. I think they might have lost in the national championship game, or in the Final Four or something in the prep school national championship. And all of a sudden now he's got 10 offers that he wouldn't have had if he hadn't have done that. At the time, I remember telling someone close to him, like, I don't really get it. Like, why do you, if he's not getting the offers here, he's not going to get the offers there. And I was wrong. I can admit when I was wrong. Like, so what Wendell Green did, He went to La Lu and proved that he can play, and proved that just because he's 5'9", 5'10" doesn't mean he doesn't deserve Division I offers. And I don't know if he would have got those offers at Country Day. I think probably at the end of the day he probably would have. But he really upped his recruiting stock last year by making that prep school move. I don't know. Again, I think that's more of the exception than the rule, but it's something to mention.
I hope that trend starts to die down, just because it's just a shame to see a lot of good local talent go elsewhere.
Right. Well, look at it in terms of some people that Timmy, and the no-goes over at North Farmington. If we didn't have this prep school thing, they'd have a top 5 player in the country in the junior class in Jaden Hardy.
Right.
So a couple years ago, North Farmington had Amari Hardy, who was a All-American candidate and ended up going to UNLV. And his brother is a junior right now, is considered the number 1 prospect at the off guard in the nation. And,
no kidding.
He should be at the North Farmington right now.
How you feeling about Izzo and his crew this year?
Oh, good, man. He's still a great coach. I know he's got to win that one more national championship to kind of solidify at what level of the pantheon he sits at when we're talking historical legacy wise. But there are very few coaches in America that I would rather have at the helm of my program than Tom Izzo. Everyone's got no one's perfect, and there are some things I look at him that I wish he would change, but it's he's done it this way for the last 25 years, and he's been pretty successful at it. I don't think he's going to be changing anytime soon. I do believe he'll get that last national championship before he heads off and leaves, walks into the sunset. But Cassius Winston, outside of Magic Johnson and maybe Steve Smith, I don't know who's been a better in the backcourt at Michigan State than Cassius Winston.
He's such
obviously Cleaves.
Winston's such a hard worker. I just love watching him play. You just don't see that effort out of anybody.
No, it's in some ways he's like a better man's Mateen. He's like a more offensively gifted Mateen.
I just don't know, being as small as he is, I don't see how he does some of the things he does, but he manages to do it. He's a great distributor.
He's the smartest player, one of the smartest players I've ever covered.
Yeah, seems like he's a good kid too.
Yeah, he's got a solid head on his shoulders, and he turned himself into a shooter. That was my one in my evaluation of him coming into college, is the one thing I worried about. And I was making the comparison to Cleaves at that time too, being like, he can't be a Mateen. Oh, well, that's actually that's a little disingenuous too, because even though Cleaves wasn't a great shooter, he still took him to a national championship in college. But Cassius Winston, went into the lab in between his freshman and sophomore year in college and turned himself into a great 3-point shooter. And it was just kind of the cherry on the sundae, because he was already a tremendous player and a tremendous playmaker. And now he's going to go down as one of the greatest to ever put on a Spartan basketball uniform.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's pretty impressive.
I'm cautiously optimistic about this season. It seems like whenever they go in this high rated and with this much expectations, it just seems like disappointment follows.
I have no optimism with my Indiana Hoosiers. Unfortunately, my whole childhood growing up, Indiana was an elite program, and I wasn't a fan of theirs because I was a Michigan State fan. Then I went to Indiana, and the second I went there in the late 90s is when we stopped being an elite program, and we haven't got back there since.
Were you there when Bobby Knight was there, or was he already gone by the time you got there?
No, yeah, it was my last. I ended with him, and then Dane Fife, my buddy Dane, took us on a miracle run into the Final Four in 2002. Went to the final game, lost in the championship to Maryland.
Was that Mike Davis's team?
Yeah, Mike Davis's team. Yeah. So other than that one year in 2002, it's been a rough road as a Hoosier fan the last 20 years.
What happened to the Indiana recruits? Are they just going out of state now?
Yeah, they're just not going to Indiana, unfortunately.
Yeah, I had this conversation the other day with a friend of mine, and actually we threw in we were talking about all-time greatest, and we obviously talked about Larry Bird a little bit and how the ISU program has been non-existent ever since he left, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
It is disappointing to see, just as a fan of the sport, I hate not seeing Indiana up there in the top. You know what I mean?
I don't even need them to win national championships. I just want them to just compete for long tournament runs.
Hey, their football team's been decent.
I know. Still, I can't be an Indiana football fan. Something wrong about saying you're an Indiana football fan.
Man, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk to me today.
Yeah, for sure, man. Anytime you need me to come back, I'd love to come back.
Yeah, and then anytime you want to come on, let me know. Anytime you got anything coming up, just give me a shout and we'll get you back on. Do you have anything else? Do you have any websites that you want to plug out there?
Yeah, just go to my web magazine, Gangster Report, www.gangsterreport.com. And it's I kind of describe it as the Rolling Stone magazine of the underworld, where you're going to get kind of just like my podcast, where we kind of try to find this nexus between pop culture and crime. It's not just for geeks that want to know about, this mobster got arrested or this drug dealer's coming out of prison. We dig a lot deeper than that.
All right, everybody. Don't forget to check out the original Gangster Podcast. You can find it on most major platforms, I'm assuming.
Yep, radio.com, iTunes.
All right, everybody. We've been here with Scott Burnstein. Thanks, Scott. All right, that's all we have for today. Special thanks to Scott Burnstein for joining us. Thanks, Scott. Everybody, in the meantime, see you next time. Keep on loving each other.